You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello and welcome to Switched On Australia. Thanks for joining me. I'm Anne Delaney. Now, across the energy transition, households are being asked to do some heavy lifting, to fix market failures, absorb risks, pay for hidden costs and spend their lives around a system that isn't really designed with them in mind. My guest today says that unless we flip that mindset, we risk building a high-renewables grid that fails the very people it depends on. Craig Memery is a long-time consumer energy advocate and senior advisor with the Justice and Equity Centre. As you'll hear in our very broad-ranging discussion, it seems households are acting as shock absorbers for an increasingly complex electricity system. Take curtailment, for instance. That's switching off surplus solar and wind during the middle of the day. Well, that's about to become a routine part of a high renewables grid. The government's new solar sharer scheme offers households 3 hours of free power in the middle of the day to help soak up some of that excess. But will free electricity at lunchtime simply mean higher bills at dinner? And why are we leaning so heavily on households to shift their behaviour when large industrial loads could do 10 times more, 10 times faster? And for renters, shift workers or anyone who can't move their usage to the middle of the day, could solar sharer leave them paying for other people's benefits? And what about the one solution that could help everyone through the energy transition? Energy efficiency. It can cut bills, emissions and peak demand, yet still gets called embroidery by the Energy Minister. Even this language of the energy industry seems to reveal a deeper problem. People can get cast as tools to stabilise the system, but not as partners in shaping it. And that is eroding trust. I started my discussion with Craig Memery by asking him to outline why we might be heading for a grid where 50% of renewable energy could be thrown away sometimes because there's literally nowhere for it to go.
We will have times when we've got 100 or more gigawatts of renewable energy that tends to have a lot of generation at the same time, and that's not always aligned with our load. You will have more than we need. We'll have some flexibility in demand. It'll allow us to soak some of that up to a point. Obviously, batteries will be a tool for soaking some of that up as well, but batteries will fill up. We will have the energy networks that take the energy from one place to another when there is a surplus as well, also have their constraints and can have bottlenecks in there too. So I would expect that what we've recently seen now, which has been a bit of an uptick in curtailment, both rooftop solar but also in at a utility scale, is a small sign of a much bigger thing to come. I do think we will end up seeing a lot more regular, deeper curtailment, and I expect we'll see it grow exponentially over the next decade. And the message that I have on that is that's a natural part of moving to a renewable system. Yes, it gives us some problems to solve, but the biggest problems that we need to manage there are how we do that fairly, how we maintain investment signals for investors so that when they face that future of uncertainty, they know that they're going to have some certainty in their revenue. How do we make sure households aren't left behind and the decisions that they make about putting solar on their roofs, for example, now, and batteries aren't made with the assumption that they'll be able to export all the time when they're producing.
So how do we do that, Craig? How do we make it fair for everyone? Because a lot of people would say that that's wasted energy. You know, it's just it's going nowhere when we actually need that energy at other times and elsewhere potentially.
I think the idea that it's a problem we need to accept is a naturally hard notion for people to adapt to. We want to decarbonise our energy system. The renewable energy that goes to waste during those times it appears free because it's surplus to needs. It's zero carbon. It's displacing, when it's used, often carbon-based energy. I think what we need to acknowledge is that during these times of curtailment, the value of that energy, if you like, becomes a lot lower.
Worthless?
No, I wouldn't say worthless. I think that that's a laden term. I'd say it gets to a point where we just don't need it all. And the decarbonisation impacts. So if we're at a point now during some of these low system load events where if we try and liberate energy from one solar array to put it into the grid, all it's doing is displacing energy from another solar array. No, there's no carbon benefit necessarily in just switching off one solar source so that you can switch on another. Absolutely, there are the opportunities to use some of that energy more smartly and to shift load. And this has been a big focus of my advocacy work over many years, has been flexible demand reforms so that we can maximise the use of flexible demand, both to reduce the need of peak energy demand from the system, but also to maximise utilisation of renewables during those times of surplus. And of course, batteries will be able to be used to some extent as well. But what we need to remember is that batteries naturally eat their own lunch. The more that are there, the more it dampens the same price volatility signal that they need to build a business case. And so there will naturally be a point where we've hit the sweet spot for the amount of batteries that we have. And beyond that, a new battery that is added, if we want it to fill the reliability gap and if we want it to only be used to suck up that surplus energy, their use will need to be managed in a way that limits their ability to capitalize on those resources. I do think we'll probably reach a time in the wholesale market where AEMO, the market operator, will need to have visibility and control over the state of charge of batteries to assure us that we can maximise our use of clean energy as the tool that fills our potential reliability gaps, and that we stretch that as far as possible by managing the state of charge of batteries as a sort of market tool or something like that. Until we get to that point, we're left with the situation we have now, where those batteries are operating in a contestable market space with the different value streams that they have, and only one limited amount of that is really about filling that gap, if you like, of creating demand when needed. Batteries are often thought of as a tool for firming generation. I like to think of them also as a tool for firming demand, because this is a role that they actually have, and it will be a more prominent role.
Can I just go back to that issue of fairness with curtailment? There is a risk, isn't there, that it's going to be consumers that are going to have to cop the lot on having to, I suppose, deal with this issue of curtailment, because there's talk that, people will have to pay to be able to get rid of their excess energy.
We're already seeing this issue now of consumers copping it, and it's in a way that you might not necessarily intuitively think. So for some years now, we've seen coming on the horizon a thing called minimum system load. And this is basically when there is so little demand and so much generation in the system that it becomes difficult to maintain the security of the energy system. By security, we mean maintaining the frequency and voltage and a few other attributes of the energy system. To maintain that stability of the system, we need to curtail some renewables. Now, when faced with this at reasonably shorter notice than expected, because it took AEMO a bit by surprise, AEMO was asked by, I won't say asked by that, let's say pressure from governments, which is understandable, to say, keep your hands off rooftop solar. It's, we know that we're long past the point in time where it's acceptable to go, beating up on rooftop solar politically, and at the same time, it's become a real issue of protecting people's entitlement to export to the grid. So what AEMO has done to deal with these minimum system load events is, instead of, say, offering solar customers some sort of compensation for just switching off a bit of their load, They are requiring utility scale batteries in the morning on some days to discharge and stay discharged in anticipation of charging when there is surplus demand in the system so that households don't need to be curtailed, and then potentially directing those batteries later in the day to discharge. Now, on the surface of it, you think, okay, that's great. We're supporting households exporting demand, and we're supporting the use of renewables. But when you pick it apart, you start to realize that it's an intervention that's not necessarily working in the best interest of people or of industry. During the moments when we have those minimum system load events, the spot price for energy is negative. And what that means is that generators that are exporting are paying to export in the wholesale market. So these issues that households are facing for paying for export is something that utility scale generators are facing. The flip side of that is that during those times, there's an incentive to use more energy from the grid because retailers are paid for what you consume. So negative pricing is a hard thing to get your head around, but in short, it's a complete reversal of the economics of energy. Generators are paid to export, people are paid to consume. So at the same time, those generators in the wholesale market have switched off if they can, because they know that they would just be paying to export. And to direct those batteries to charge and discharge, there is a compensations framework that is invoked that means that those batteries are entitled to seek compensation for values that are very, very much above and beyond what the wholesale market price is that they're being asked to discharge and charge at. They're compensated for the opportunity cost, for example. So it's a blunt tool that is being used to avoid the largely political issue of requiring people to reduce their household export. It's adding costs to do so, significant costs. It's actually reducing flexibility of how the participants operate in the market, and it's not improving. Most importantly, it's not even improving the emissions outcome, because it's just replacing some solar with others, and it actually might be making the emissions outcome worse, because it's forcing energy to cycle through batteries where there is a round trip efficiency loss, and it's forcing those batteries to not optimize the energy in the system, but forcing them to only optimize the narrower portion of energy coming out of households. So there are better ways of doing this if you look at it from the perspective of balancing reliability and security with consumer impacts, with industry impacts and investment, and that is to use a more dynamic approach.
So, I mean, the government has recently announced that it's going to bring in a program called the Solar Sharer Program that'll come in next year, where all households will get 3 hours of free electricity during the middle of the day. And that is to sop up some of that excess solar that would be curtailed or wasted. To what extent do you think that that is going to address this issue that you've been talking about?
Yeah, the solar sharer offer, if you like, and how this is being introduced is it's part of what's called the default market offer. This is a sort of form of retail regulation that is designed to protect people a bit by putting a cap on what retailers can charge for basic energy products. And what the government's done is they've said that they'll introduce a specific new type of DMO, which is one that people can opt into, that has zero charge for using energy during 11 and 2. On the surface of it, you think, great idea, because it's going to help to mop up some of that surplus solar. It's going to give people an opportunity to access energy for really cheap and free. I think you'll see some people really innovating and using batteries to maximize their use of energy during that time to offset their cost of energy at other times. For households that don't use a lot of energy, or for households that have got big batteries, they could actually use that to potentially offset most or all of their demand at other times. So you'd see people who end up only using energy from that particular time of day under that program. The risk of unintended consequences for this, though, is what really worries me. And I could look at a few examples of how that might play out. Now, one great feature of the energy transition at the moment is electrification. It's in full swing, and we've got people shifting from gas to electricity. We've got policy starting to really catch up with that, at least in a couple of jurisdictions, and the inevitability of it is pretty obvious, right? With that comes a shift from a summer peaking energy system to a winter peaking energy system. And what that brings with it is a shift from a time when happily the amount of energy that is generated on a day-to-day basis coincides a bit with how much of it falls on us from the sky, to one where there's a disconnect there, right? More of our energy demand, because of space heating that's shifted to electric in particular, and slightly less efficient use of heat pumps during colder periods, because heat pumps are extra efficient when it's warm, and they're still efficient when it's cold, but they use more energy when it is cold. So what we'll start to see is more energy demand occurring on those days in winter and on those cloudy days. And what that means is that rather than having predominantly free, cheap, surplus energy going into that, we will move inevitably to a point where there will be more cost in procuring that energy during those times of day. So as we do that, I don't know if it'll be 6 months or I don't know if it'll be 6 years, but the more successful the solar sharer product is in shifting behaviour, the sooner we will get to a point where we can't sustain the product. And my question is, well, what happens then?
Yeah.
And when I've had a similar conversation with network businesses about a solar saver product that they've used for energy network tariffs, and that's where they've said, all right, we'll provide incentives for people to use more energy in their local network during those times. I've asked the same question of them, and what they've said is, oh, well, we'll just change the product then.
Right.
And the concern I have with that is, okay, that responds to the problem. It means you don't end up baking in a new cross subsidy if you do that sooner.
But you'll be taking something away from consumers.
Exactly. So when people have gone and made their investments in their electric vehicles and their smart devices and their batteries and their heat pumps to operate in these certain ways with certain settings in a very narrow particular period of time, what does that mean for them? Are they then going to have to get are they lucky enough to be able to just get their device reprogrammed in a way that takes advantage of whatever the other opportunities are? Maybe they didn't have solar and now they can install it. For some people, there will be opportunities. But for some people, for example, potentially renters or people in apartments whose only opportunity to participate has been to install a battery off the back of this program, they might then not have the opportunity to get the value back that they expected if that rug is pulled from under them because that product can no longer be offered. In the meantime, before we even get to that point, we need to be aware that the solar sharer program, the solar sharer product, will increase wholesale spot prices. It's designed to do that in effect. So, that's inevitable. By increase, that means they could be going from negative 100 to negative 50 or whatever it might be. They could be going from negative to zero value. They could go from zero to a positive value. It also means, though, that during those times of high demand, they can go from being high to even much higher.
So what impact will that have on households, Craig?
Well, this is in a regulated product. And what that means is that for the households participating, that shouldn't change anything in that moment, except for that money still has to come from somewhere. And when the regulator sets that DMO product, they take that into account. So you'll see the retailers have to get their money back from one of three places conceptually. Either they get it back from the same consumers at other times of day.
Yes, in the evening when we still need to put the heaters on and turn the oven on.
Yep. And eventually, maybe not initially, but eventually that benefit will be outweighed by the cost.
Right.
The other place they could get it from, of course, is from other consumers at the same time of day. So if retailers are having to give some consumers free energy, some people free energy during that time period, but the cost of them supplying that goes up, is that actually then going to be recovered from other people who might be people who are locked out of batteries and opportunities to participate and VPPs and CER and electric vehicles? They could be people who are more disadvantaged.
That would be an irony because it's being sold on the basis that it enables people who are currently locked out of the renewable transition, who don't have the solar or the EVs or the batteries, etc., to participate through the grid.
And if you take a helicopter view, that's absolutely true. But when you drill down into understanding different people real people and their real experience of their opportunities and the energy system,
Yeah.
then you see that we can't generalize in that way and still be assured that we're protecting the people who need it most.
Yes.
It's the people who, for example, work during the day, are renters, don't have the opportunity to install a grid-connected battery or something. If they can't control their load during the day, if they don't have a tool to be able to do that, and unless they're lucky enough to have a landlord who's interested in making that investment and they are able enough to have a conversation with their landlord about that and understand the opportunities, unless those particular ducks can all be lined up, they might not benefit at all, but they might end up paying for the privilege that other people have to be able to benefit. And my biggest concern there is of the people who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged, how much do they end up going? Will they end up carrying the costs and the unforeseen or unanticipated costs of something like that?
So just on that issue of the solar sharers, Craig, are we leaning on households instead of enabling the big, more flexible industrial loads that would make a much larger difference faster?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is why in the demand response mechanism review that's just been and gone, we encourage the AMC to think about tools that could be, to think about using the demand response mechanism in a way that's kind of in the reverse. Basically using the existing baseline approaches to allow aggregators to incentivize people to switch energy on during those times of cheap demand. Cheap electricity when there's low demand on the system. That would be a really sensible way to dynamically fill that gap that didn't create the unintended consequence of increasing winter load during times when there might not be so much surplus supply.
So, Craig, what would have been, in your view, a smarter approach than the solar sharer scheme?
Well, this goes to the issue of dynamic versus set and forget incentives. And this cuts across a whole lot of areas of our energy system in transition. We have variable renewable resources. They give us free energy conceptually at times, and it's clean energy. And we want to make the most of that, but they are variable. In that respect, they differ qualitatively from less flexible or inflexible set and forget coal that's available usually until it breaks down, and gas that is more available on demand. Now, we want to maximize our use of those renewable resources when they are available, and that means we need more dynamic settings rather than fixed settings, and we need more opportunities to participate in a way that reflects the potential business models and tools that are available that can do that. So rather, for example, than have an always on 11 till 2 tariff, I don't know, I'll frame it as an either or just because it's easy to compare the two. I'm not suggesting that we only use one solution, but if we enable better use of flexible demand resources with incentives that support people doing that in a dynamic way, that signal can be linked to when there are surplus renewables, not just what the time of day is. And that means that on the days when we have surplus renewables that are for more than that 3-hour window, we can tap into that. It means that on days where we don't actually have surplus renewables because it's the middle of winter and it's a cold day, demand is high, it's cloudy, there's not a lot of wind blowing or sun shining on that particular day for that very brief time, we don't have the signal that's encouraging people to use more energy during that time as well. I'll use one example. I bang on a lot about the wholesale demand response mechanism, which is a tool that allows industrial users to be compensated and paid to use less energy during peak demand events. There are two related options for that, if you like, that could improve how that mechanism works. Both of these were recently put to the AEMC in the review that they did. One is to make it symmetrical or a two-way scheme. And so that would involve, rather than just paying people when they use less energy, you could actually use the same framework in the mechanism to pay people during negative price events when they use more.
Just to clarify, I mean, the demand response mechanism, this is for big industrial loads, isn't it? This is focused on industry as opposed to householders and consumers.
Yep, that's a really important point, and that's why the other half of that change that would need to be made, which we maintain is an important change to make anyway, is to extend that mechanism to households. We maintain that that's a real potentially a lost opportunity. Every year that we don't do that is a lost opportunity to tap in to the willingness that households have to partner with a provider of their choice to share the benefits that they could of using energy differently in a way that has benefits in the wholesale energy market, and those benefits flow through to everyone as well as the participating consumers.
Yeah, can we do that now, Craig?
Well, yes and no. You can do it now if your retailer permits, or if you're lucky enough to be with a retailer who has a product of that type. And there are a few retailers who offer VPPs, for example, or other tools for that purpose. But there's a real challenge in relying on retailers to provide that, and that is that retailers have by and large contracted and hedged away their exposure to that wholesale price volatility already through their contracts with generators and with storage and with large users for load. So to participate in demand response really requires exposure to volatility in price and to high levels of price, so that when the price is high, you can get the benefit of reducing the load at those right times. But most retailers have reduced most of their exposure to that, so they don't have the incentive to offer to households through participation in demand response events that a demand response provider might if they were in the market in the way that they are for large users, where they actually compete with generators to be dispatched at those times when prices are high. They bid in, they're dispatched alongside generation to reduce the need for generation at those times. Now,
Does Amber? Can Amber do that?
Amber is probably of my understanding of what they offer in their VPP program. It's
Yeah.
probably the closest thing to that, because Amber has a business model which is about giving people exposure to those wholesale prices.
Yes.
I understand they've also got some hedging in place to provide some protection, which makes good sense, but their model is actually about passing through that price benefit. When I look at it from the perspective of the majority of people who are in the space, and people who aren't just with VPPs, most people aren't with a retailer who offers that level of exposure. And that level of exposure doesn't necessarily suit everyone. It
No.
does mean that they're exposed to high prices all of the time. Oh, sorry, exposed to the spot price all the time. It's important not to conflate volatile price with high price or spot price with high price. It's just that price risk has been managed away in standard retail contracts where that volatility has been removed and the exposure to those high price options have been removed.
Craig, it seems that, a lot of things that we've been talking about here, it has been about how we get consumers to do things for the energy transition. And there's a lot of mantra that's going around now, certainly from industry, that they want to put consumers at the center of the energy system. There's a lot of talk about this, but that hasn't happened yet, has it? What's your perspective on this?
Look, I think, and I reflect on this a lot because I've been a consumer advocate for 10 years now. And if I think of the thing about my job that I like least, it's the title. It's thinking of people as consumers. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is, the energy transition is well underway, and that's a good thing. We are in the messy middle, and a feature of that messy middle is we consistently keep bumping up against the human element. And I think there's a lot we can learn to make that transition smoother and faster and fairer. And I have noticed a lot that we use language that is based around the idea of putting consumers at the center. And I think we actually need to drop that language or at least change it. And there are two main reasons for this. The first is that it doesn't really resonate with people. I've been lucky enough to engage with people in every state of the country in my role as an advocate and seek to understand, their interests and concerns and motivations and opportunities and perspectives and needs in relation to energy. And one thing that strikes me is that I've never met anyone who identifies as a consumer. I've
No.
not people who identify as different things to do with their lives, as a grandmother and as a friend and as a berry farmer
Yes.
and as Fatima and as Graham, but I've not ever had someone come up to me and shake my hand and say, "Oh, hi, I'm a consumer." And I think as well, people don't consider themselves to be part of the energy system by and large. They consider themselves to be part of families and communities and other things. They don't consider their CER, their energy resources, their batteries and solar, to not. I mean, this is probably one where different people have different views, but
Mm.
I think they consider that to be part of their home first and foremost. Maybe part of the energy system secondarily, but for a lot of people, they actually see that as a way that they have independence from the energy system.
Yes.
We can't assume that those people are going to be easy to entice to consider that tool that they've got to get that independence to be part of it. And I think the other aspect is when we say we're putting people at the center, I think a lot of people hear that as we've got you surrounded. They don't identify with this thing that we might see of a happy, joyous energy transition
Yes.
where that person has to be in the middle of it. They might prefer to be off to the side and just have the energy supply that they need be provided reliably, sustainably, and cleanly, and hopefully affordably as well. And so I think that's the first part of it. Like that idea, it doesn't resonate for people to say we're putting them at the center, calling them consumers and putting them at the center of.
So if it doesn't resonate, Craig, and if much of the energy transition is being framed around consumer choice and market signals, and people don't see themselves as consumers, and they don't see their rooftop solar or batteries as part of it, but rather, as you said, part of their home, does it mean that the energy transition needs a completely different narrative to work?
It's a great question. I mean, I tend to try and think firstly of consumers as people because that's what they are and that's what they do identify with. And rather than putting it in the center, just thinking about their needs and interests and putting them first. Now,
Mm.
that's a change of words more so than a change of sentiment for most people, but I think it's an important one. And it goes to where the way our energy market governance is established might be able to be improved. Now, a lot of people will be familiar with the NEO, National Electricity Objective. And the National Electricity Objective for a long time was all about the long-term interest of consumers with respect to price, reliability, safety, security, and quality of supply of energy. There's also an NGO for gas, which has a similar element to it. In recent years, the NEO was updated to include climate, so our climate targets are in there. That's a great development, but it hasn't been updated to include the human and the social beyond people as consumers. It thinks of it invokes price as a feature of people's consumption of energy, reliability in terms of their supply of energy. It doesn't have a social element. It doesn't actually consider people's quality of life. It doesn't consider, even though we know that energy is so important for their comfortable housing, the way their home uses energy is so important for their quality of life and comfort. We know that people's CER and DER tools have a lot of use for them and features that aren't just what they're integrating with the energy system for. And we know that the social license issues that have been a real barrier to getting large-scale transmission and renewables built in some areas, they reflect the human element of the energy transition. It's not just that people are complaining for no reason about things that we need. We need to accept that some people's lives are changed in ways they might not like by having a renewable energy system or a transmission line in their space. So I do think we need to consider it as putting people first, and that doesn't mean putting business last, because we do need businesses to exist. I mean, we have a largely privatized energy system. So, like it or lump it, a feature of that is that we have to make it work for the businesses that we rely on for affordable and reliable and sustainable energy. So putting people first doesn't mean making energy unprofitable for businesses, but it does mean thinking about fit for purpose business models. It means, do we just keep giving everything to retailers to do, like metering, like VPPs, like other things that might not be part of a retailer business model or part of what a person thinks of a retailer as providing for them? Or do we open that up and say, okay, well, let's make that more genuinely competitive and contestable and give it to the right party to do? Give it to someone who's actually got an interest in that, rather than relying on their retailer for a deal so they can charge their EV at a certain time. A battery charge provider, aggregator, someone who can offer them that service and provide the service in a way that works for them, rather than just providing it in a way that is a potentially square peg in the round hole of an existing energy market participant. Would be a productive way of progressing that.
So do we need to think much more broadly about this issue of social license, the social license of the consumer? I'm nervous about using that terminology at the moment, but the social license of the consumer for the entire energy transition, not just the social license for big scale renewables in regional areas, which, as you pointed out, is a legitimate issue, but we need to think a bit more broadly about this issue of social license.
Absolutely. And I mean, I tend to think that we might remember the old idea of the trilemma. It became popular after South Australia had a blackout and the chief scientist did a review of energy system needs afterwards. The trilemma is this idea that we're seeking to balance price, reliability, and emissions or sustainability of supply. And it could be thought of in another way too, which is the boxes that can be ticked by different tools that we have. So, and the reason it's called a trilemma, which brings about the idea of a dilemma, is because theoretically you can't have all three of those satisfied by any solution. So you can have either something might be cheaper and more reliable, like say, I don't know, gas might have once fit that bill, but it's not going to help you get your emissions down. Or something might help your emissions down and be cheap. You could argue if we had nothing but solar in the system and no other batteries or anything, then it might be viewed as unreliable tool for doing that, even though it provides a lot of cheap energy. Interestingly, though, I think there is one thing that actually does tick all the boxes for the trilemma, and it's energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the only tool that we have, and I include in that smart use of energy. It's the only tool we have that can bring down price and bring down emissions and improve reliability. Because when we make a system more efficient, we need less on the supply side to meet the gaps in energy supply for that. Also, when I think about the human element, then coming back to the trilemma, I think it's missing from that in the same way it's missing from the national electricity objective. And although the term is so clumsy, and I'm totally on the market for a better term if someone's got one, if you think of it as a quadlemma, I'm not proposing we use that, but the four elements: price, reliability, emissions, and the human element, social license.
Yeah.
The elements that are related to people's experience as humans, not just price. I'd say price is only a narrow element of cost for a start. If we talk about people's experience of the cost of energy, the price is only one part of it. It's how much energy they use multiplied by the price often is what dictates their actual experience. But even then, cost is only one element of the human experience of energy. And so I think we need to consider that fourth angle when we are considering the transition. And this is why it's so challenging to get things like the community social license aspects smoothed over or addressed properly in relation to things like renewable energy zones. That doesn't have a neat fit into the tribal narrative. So if we expand that into considering those, I'm not saying it's an easy problem to solve, but we can't solve the problem without considering that human element for social license in that way. And the other aspect I would say about social license is the social license of the transition that isn't just the experiencing communities, but it's the social license for orchestration. So when we talk about getting the benefits out of VPPs and so on, that requires people to hand over control of their devices and the things that they've invested in. Now, when energy retailers tend to not enjoy a great default position of trust as it is, it's an obvious barrier that presents in giving them some control in that case. And so if we have the opportunity for more tools that allow people to engage in the way that they want, I think it helps to address that part of the social license piece as well. And the other part of the social license piece is, every second election, people have a bill waved at them in the lead up to it by a party or an opposition saying, we're going to reduce your bills by $200 or $500 or whatever it is. And I think people are sick of hearing that, and that's never happened. So to consider that aspect of the social license as well, there really needs to be a focus on affordability, but bringing people along for the ride of the transition without forcing them into the center of it all.
So, Craig, I just want to go back to that issue of energy efficiency, which really does dovetail with some of the things you've been saying about the human side of things. What's your response to people who say we don't need to do energy efficiency because we're doing renewables, and that's the fastest, most efficient way to do the energy transition? And it's quite a strong view in a lot of sectors. What's your response to that?
My response to that tends to depend on how frustrated I'm feeling on a given day. As someone who's been an energy efficiency advocate for a long time, I often have a sense of, oh, here we go again. And other times when I'm feeling more patient, I think, well, the good thing about us having really not tapped into the opportunity of energy efficiency is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still for us to take on. So as soon as we are able to shift to understanding the potential value of energy efficiency, the better. I do think there's an element of it which is just what people are exposed to. Our businesses and our institutions and our governments have generally spent most of their lives in their roles with a sense of what the supply side is. People understand the idea you supply energy and it goes to where it's demanded. There's a lot less understanding of the potential benefits and opportunities for reducing that demand, especially as it relates back to the supply side. And I think part of that is...
Just give me an overview of what those benefits are, Craig.
So in a nutshell, the first one I go to, it comes back to the idea of the trilemma, if you like. Energy efficiency can reduce costs. It reduces the amount of energy that is needed from generation in the system. And in doing so, it places downward pressure on wholesale prices. It does that by reducing energy demand around the clock and including at peak times, which are the main driver of high wholesale prices. It can also improve reliability because it allows us to use less energy, allowing more of that generation capacity, battery storage capacity, whatever it is, to be in reserve for when needed. And so importantly, and this is why I get particularly frustrated with the idea that we need to choose between renewables and energy efficiency helps decarbonize in a way that is often quicker to deploy, has better social license implications, is easier, is more enduring than just decarbonizing with renewables. And we're in a situation now where even though we've been deeply installing a lot of renewables in the energy system, I don't think the emissions on average of the renewable energy system is actually dropping. And that's because demand is going up. So we have a very obvious example in front of us of why, if you reduce demand, it reduces emissions. So I think I'll be a bit provocative here and I'll say that people who are, I'll say, promoting the idea that there needs to be a choice made between renewables and energy efficiency is really counterproductive for decarbonising the energy system. We need to do both. And if we continue to think it's an either-or question, it comes at the peril of slowing down our energy transition.
If energy efficiency is the ultimate no-brainer, and I'd actually also add healthier, more comfortable homes to the list of benefits that you've just outlined, why do you think the system keeps treating it like an afterthought, or as I heard the energy minister refer to it as embroidery?
Yeah. I think there might be a few things at play there. I think energy efficiency programs usually don't come with a great big infrastructure ribbon to cut. It's often said, it's been said for years that, energy efficiency isn't sexy. It's a bit like cleaning your room. It's something that you do because it's got its benefits, but it's not something that has necessarily a great deal of appeal. It's not as exciting as getting solar panels on your roof or a new battery or something that you can show off. And I think in the case of the energy policy and in the case of our regulatory frameworks and all of that, I think supply is the comfort zone of our regulators and rulemakers and governments, and it's obviously the money zone for the market participants. So, your generators, your storage businesses, your network businesses, and this is true, just as true of fossil fuel as it is renewables businesses, energy efficiency is anathema to their business interests.
Because they want us to keep using more energy.
They profit from us using more energy.
Mm.
So that's a real barrier. Unless we have business models that allow someone to make a reasonable amount of money out of energy efficiency, and there are limited tools for that. You can sell the energy efficient devices and appliances. You can provide the services for operating them. But even our reforms, as we've sort of touched on, even our reform frameworks seem to be geared towards only more what retailers can do rather than what those other third-party providers can do. So we lose the opportunity for the linked up service provision that would allow us to use energy efficiency and smart demand in a way that would start to really tap into those potential benefits.
You've said that the energy market institutions don't see energy efficiency as their job. Whose job is it?
I think we've seen government take steps, often good, into energy efficiency over many years. We've seen energy efficiency target schemes and certificate schemes. Local council have been particularly good at energy efficiency enabling and supporting and getting the word out, although they're in less of an enviable position in terms of having the funds to actually subsidise the programs. I think if you look at the federal government level, the renewable energy target has been a fantastic and successful and effective piece of legislation over years, and it's really what our whole renewable sector is built on. But it only provides renewable energy. It doesn't give us the opportunity to use less energy to the same goals. I do think government has a role, but I do think our market institutions need to improve their understanding of the demand side generally. And that means having often tools given to them, things for them to do that require them to skill up to learn that. Similarly, with the regulator, there are tools that the regulator has at their disposal in their regulatory context that allow for helping to incentivize distribution and transmission networks to consider demand-side options and demand reduction options. They're pretty small fry in terms of the amount of revenue that's available for those, and it hasn't really been enough to change the culture of a lot of network businesses from one where they are focused on investments for supply side to one where they seek a balance between demand and supply. Maybe we need to see moving to different tools and models in a regulatory sense, where the businesses themselves have an opportunity to profit from not what just they spend on building stuff, but what they spend on operating the system, and potentially therefore tools to reduce demand as well. All of that needs to come from government and from ministers in the case of the national energy market and individual governments. And that's why it is concerning when We do hear things like, the demand side being described as embroidery. In my more optimistic moments, though, I do think we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we are getting to the point of understanding collectively that the energy transition involves putting a bit of focus onto the supply side and the demand side both. We need to probably start considering VPPs, virtual power plants, in the same way we consider RESs as renewable energy zones, as being a tool to allow us to make a big dent in the things that we need to keep making the transition.
So, Craig, just a final question. What do you think, in your view, could happen if we really genuinely paired energy efficiency and the energy transition to renewables at scale, rather than treating these concepts as competing priorities?
I think we could continue the energy transition in a way that it is smoother and faster and fairer. If we actually seek to put some balance between our demand side development and supply side, where we use tools like the integrated system plan and like any incentives that are put in place for using and generating energy, if we actually seek to embrace the demand side as we do the supply side, it'll allow us to decarbonize faster because we're less reliant on building out more transmission and more large-scale renewables to get to the same level of decarbonisation. It'll allow us to address those social licence issues because there's so much that can be done in terms of energy efficiency and smart demand that actually makes people's lives better through better homes and better outcomes in people's communities and things that they identify with, that I do think we can really take a lot of the bumps out of the energy transition.
Craig Memery, thank you so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Anne. Much appreciated.
And Craig Memery is a long-time consumer energy advocate and senior advisor with the Justice and Equity Centre. Curtailment, flexible demand, tariff reform. Clearly, none of it will succeed if people are just regarded as levers to pull rather than partners in a shared system. That's all we have time for today. I'm Anne Delaney. I hope you can join me next time on Switched On Australia.